There are moments in life that last only a few minutes but are enough to make you remember them for years to come. A black woman, a private airport, a multi-million-dollar private jet, it's all hers. But she was stopped. Not because of a lack of documents, not because of a procedural error, but simply because of a glance and a cold statement. You don't belong here. If it were you, what would you do? Will you remain silent to avoid trouble? Will you explain, even though you know deep down you don't need to? Or will you stand still facing an entire system that doubts your existence? This story isn't just about discrimination. It's about those moments when we're forced to choose between peace and self-respect, between moving on or standing still to say something that needs to be said. Perhaps you've been in a situation like that before. Not at the airport, but somewhere else in your life. If you've ever wondered, if only I hadn't stayed silent that day, then stay with this story. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join us on the journey of Alyssa Monroe, a quiet story, but one that can make you reflect on yourself. It's raining very lightly. Not the kind of torrential rain, but rather thin, even droplets of water quietly covering the gray, concrete pavement of Harbor Executive Airfield, a private airport nestled on the northern edge of New Jersey. The yellow lights from the control towers reflected off the fuselage of a Gulfstream G800 parked silently on the runway. The gleaming white paint made the aircraft appear to glow in the misty rain. It's an aircraft worth over 70 million US dollars. And tonight, it's waiting for a single passenger. The woman was standing less than 10 feet from the airplane steps. She was wearing a dark gray hoodie, black, stretchy pants, and worn but clean white sneakers. A plain, unassuming, logo-free leather tote bag slung over her shoulder. In her hand was a small, rolling suitcase. At first glance, no one would think she belonged here. No one except the airplane itself. "Ma'am," a man's voice rang out deep and harsh. The woman stopped. She turned her head very slowly, as if she were used to being called back in that way. In front of her stood a white man approximately 60 years old. He was wearing a dark blue pilot's jacket with flight insignia on his shoulders. He held a clipboard and stood blocking the way up the stairs. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm. The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted from her shoes up her hoodie, and then settled on her neatly tied-up hair at the back of her head. "This is a private flight," he said. "It's for passengers on the list only." She nodded slightly. "Yes, I know." The pilot frowned. It was a very familiar frown, the kind of frown someone who hadn't been questioned in a long time. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," he continued. "You can't board this plane." The atmosphere seemed to become somber. The sound of rain falling on the metal surface became clearer. The woman looked him straight in the eyes. Not angry, not confused. Just a calm, deep gaze like a still lake. "My name is Alyssa Monroe," she said. "I am the only passenger on this flight." The man chuckled softly. Not loudly, but enough to hear the contempt in it. "The list says, A. Monroe," he replied. "We're waiting for the owner of the plane." She was silent for a few seconds. Then she asked very softly, "And what do you think the owner looks like?" The pilot cleared his throat. "Not like you." The words fell onto the cold, icy pavement like a broken piece of ice. In the distance, a ground staff member stood still. Another man bowed his head, pretending to check his phone. No one spoke up. Alyssa Monroe took a very slow breath. In that moment, old memories flooded back. The meeting rooms where she had been overlooked, the suspicious glances when she walked in as CEO. The times people spoke to her assistant instead of looking her in the eye. She has learned not to react. It wasn't because she was weak. It was because she understood that emotional reactions were a gift to those who wanted to control her. "I just need to get on the plane," she said. "We all have schedules." The pilot shook his head, his voice firmer. "No. I'm responsible for the security of this flight. And I don't feel comfortable." Comfortable. A very small word, but enough to shut down an entire person. "So what are you planning to do?" Alyssa asked. "I'll ask you to go back to the operations center," he replied. "If necessary, I'll call security." At this moment, Alyssa was no longer looking at him. She looked at the airplane, the plane she signed the contract for exactly 90 minutes ago. The aircraft has tail number N800AM. The plane was registered under her company's name. A cold wind swept across the runway. Alyssa Monroe slowly took her phone out of her jacket pocket. Don't rush. Don't be nervous. She lifted her head, her eyes eerily calm. Okay, she said. Then, let's clarify this. Behind the pilot, the sky grew darker, and the story has only just begun. Alyssa Monroe stood still in the damp, cold air of the runway. The phone in her hand was still unlocked. Her thumb rested lightly on the screen, but didn't touch it, not because she was hesitating, but because she was giving herself a moment. A very brief moment to ask myself, this time will I choose silence or speak up? She had been in situations like this many times before. Not at airports, but in glass-enclosed meeting rooms in high-rise buildings in Manhattan, Chicago, San Francisco, places where power wasn't in a loud voice, but in the right eye contact. 15 years ago, when Alyssa was a data analyst, she walked into a presentation where the only person who asked her was, "Are you an intern?" She remembered the feeling vividly. Not anger, but a familiar chill running down her spine. The feeling of being trapped in an invisible box, simply because of her appearance, her skin color, her unconventional clothing choices. She learned one thing very early on. If you react with emotion, they will remember that emotion. If you react with competence, they will be compelled to remember you. Alyssa Monroe wasn't always the CEO. She grew up in South Chicago in a neighborhood where people locked their doors earlier than usual at night. Her mother was a night shift nurse. Her father used to be a mechanic until a work accident left him unable to stand for long periods. No one in her family had ever been a manager, nor had anyone ever flown a private jet. But Alyssa had something no one else in the neighborhood had: a nearly cold patience with herself. She was a slow learner, not because she was incompetent, but because she wasn't allowed to make mistakes. When others failed, it was an experience. When she failed, it was proof. She understands that very well. Therefore, Alyssa always double-prepared. She read an extra report. She checked an extra line of data. She stayed an hour later to make sure she didn't miss anything. Years later, as Monroe Analytics, the biotechnology company she founded, became profitable, grew, and attracted the attention of investment funds, Alyssa maintained that habit. It wasn't because of a lack of confidence. It was because she understood that this world wouldn't grant her the privilege of just getting by. The pilot remained standing there. He looked at her this time more closely, as if trying to piece together mismatched fragments. A black woman, a hoodie, a $70 million airplane. "Ma'am," he said, his voice less harsh but still cold. "I'm just doing my job." Alyssa nodded. "I get it." She truly understood. She understood the feeling of wanting to control a space that one believed to be their own. She understood the fear of losing power felt by those accustomed to being obeyed. But understanding doesn't mean accepting. "How long have you been working here?" she asked. The pilot was slightly surprised by the question. "For over 30 years, he replied. "I've driven for the most powerful people you can imagine." Alyssa smiled very slightly. "I believe him," she said. "And perhaps that's why this is so unfortunate." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Alyssa didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her phone, unlocking the screen. The pale blue light reflected off her face, highlighting her tired but resolute features. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about the pilot. She thought about her mother, the woman who used to stand behind the hospital counter at 3 in the morning, drinking cold coffee, enduring the patient's irritability because she knew they were in pain. She always told Alyssa, "You don't need to win against anyone. You just need to not lose yourself." Alyssa carried that quote with her throughout her life. "Even today, you could call flight management," she said, her voice even. "Or, you could let me on the plane. Both options are fine." The pilot laughed, this time a little louder. "I don't need to call anyone," he replied. "I'm the one in charge here." That phrase sounded very familiar. Many people have said this to Alyssa in different contexts, but with the same belief: their power is absolute. She looked straight at him. "Power isn't something he claims," Alyssa said. "It's something he validates." The atmosphere became tense. A ground staff member approached, hesitating. "Captain Harris," he said softly, "is everything all right?" The name finally appeared. Captain Robert Harris. The pilot turned and glanced at the employee. "Fine," he snapped. "Get back to work." The employee bowed his head and stepped back. But his eyes darted quickly towards Alyssa, not with curiosity, but with something akin to apprehension. Alyssa realized that. She was used to those kinds of looks. Looks that seemed to say, I know this isn't right, but I'm not in a position to change it. It was those very eyes that led her many years ago to decide that if given the chance she wouldn't just stand on her own side, she will side with the system. The phone vibrated slightly. A message appeared. Alyssa skimmed through it. Just one short line. But it was enough. She inhaled. Then he looked up. Captain Harris, she said, calling him by his name for the first time. I'm not going to argue with you anymore. He raised his eyebrows. Finally, you understand. Alyssa shook her head very slightly. No, she said. He'll understand eventually. She held up her phone, the screen facing her. In 5 minutes, Alyssa continued, he will receive a call. And when he gets that call, she paused, everything here will change. Captain Harris gave a wry smile. I'm really looking forward to it. Alyssa Monroe said nothing more. She just stood there, in the rain, in the lights, in the midst of a system that was about to be turned a new page. In the distance, the auxiliary engine of the Gulfstream G-800 emitted a very faint sound, like a heartbeat in anticipation. The call hasn't come yet. That silence only boosted Captain Robert Harris's confidence. He stood tall, gripping the clipboard tightly against his chest like a familiar shield. To him, the world order was clear. Who could stand where? Who could speak first? Who had to wait? And the woman in front of him, in the gray hoodie, clearly didn't fit the picture he believed to be. You know, Harris said slowly, as if lecturing airline security is no joke. We can't let just anyone board a plane because they say they have the right. Alyssa Monroe didn't interrupt. She let him finish. It was an old habit of hers, to let others fully express their thoughts, to let them say things they couldn't take back later. Many people think they're special, Harris continued. Many people think money gives them the right to break the rules. Alyssa tilted her head very slightly. And you think, I'm one of them? Harris looked directly at her. I think, he said, emphasizing each word slowly, you're trying to exploit some loophole. An initial, a mistake. Those words fell upon me like a door slamming shut. Behind them, the 2 ground crew members stopped what they were doing. They were no longer pretending to be busy. The atmosphere around the runway seemed to thicken. Alyssa sensed that very clearly. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she understood this was the moment when everything would begin to take a different turn. Have you ever met me before? She asked. Harris frowned. Not yet. So, on what basis do you conclude who I am? Alyssa asked further. He hesitated for a second. Just a very brief second. But enough to reveal the truth. Based on experience, he replied. What kind of experience? Alyssa asked. Experience with the people who often appear around planes like this. Alyssa nodded. A very slow nod. Could you explain more clearly? She asked, her voice still even. So I can understand. Harris sighed, his annoyance clearly visible. Do you want me to be blunt? I want you to tell me the truth, Alyssa replied. Harris glanced around as if considering something. Then he shrugged. Okay, he said. People who own private planes don't usually travel alone. They don't dress like that, and they certainly don't need to show off who they are. Nobody said anything. The wind blew a little stronger. The rain continued to fall steadily. Alyssa felt a chill run down her spine. Not because of the words, but because of their familiarity. She had heard variations of that phrase for the past 20 years. Doesn't look like a CEO. Doesn't look like a founder. Doesn't look like someone in power. So, according to you, Alyssa said slowly, what should someone like me look like? Harris did not respond immediately. He looked at her, then at the plane, then back at her. You know, he said, it's not like this. A young ground staff member turned away, clearly uncomfortable. Alyssa took a very deep breath. For a brief moment, she felt a surge of anger, not violent, but weary. The weariness of someone who had become accustomed to standing tall in the face of suspicious stares. She thought of other black women, CEOs, founders, women who had texted her in the middle of the night asking, am I overreacting to feel disrespected? Alyssa always gave the same answer, no. You're seeing something that other people are used to considering normal. Captain Harris, she said, her voice lowering. Do you know what the most dangerous thing is in your field? Harris raised an eyebrow. What is that? It's when people believe that experience gives them the right to judge others, Alyssa replied. Instead of checking the data. Harris laughed. Are you teaching me how to do the job? No, Alyssa said. I'm reminding you of how you were trained. That statement made Harris pause for a moment. Just one beat. But Alyssa realized. She took half a step forward. Not an intrusion, just enough to assert her presence. The passenger list, she said. The aircraft registration number. Ownership records. It's all data. Harris clenched his jaw. And as I said, he growled, I don't believe you. You don't need to believe me, Alyssa replied. You just need to follow the procedure. The atmosphere became so tense you could almost touch it. A small electric car sped past, slowed down, then continued on its way. The driver glanced at the scene before him, then turned away. Harris shook his head. No, he said. I won't let you board the plane. Alyssa remained silent. The silence lasted a long time. Then she said very softly but clearly, Then, you are refusing a legal order. Harris laughed even louder. Where did she get that authority from? Alyssa looked straight at him. From the signed sales contract, she said. From the federal registration records. From the very plane that's standing behind you. Harris took a step forward, his voice sharp. You're crossing the line. Alyssa is not backing down. I've lived my whole life within the boundaries set by others, she replied. And I've learned to step outside of them without asking permission. That statement caused the atmosphere to freeze. Harris looked at her, his eyes a mixture of anger and confusion. Part of him began to sense that something was wrong, but his 30 years of experience wouldn't allow him to back down. Security, he said loudly. Call security. A ground staff member hesitated. Captain, he whispered, perhaps we should double-check. I said, call security. Harris interrupted. Alyssa closed her eyes for a second, not because of fear, but because of regret. She felt sorry for someone who had had a long career but was about to put an end to it with their own hands. The phone in her hand vibrated. This time, it wasn't a text message. It was a phone call. Alyssa opened her eyes. She looked at the screen. Then, he looked up at Harris. That call has arrived, she said. Harris paused. You should answer the phone, Alyssa continued, before things go too far. Harris looked at her, then at the phone in his jacket pocket, which was vibrating incessantly. In that moment, he stood between two choices: continue to believe in prejudice or begin to face the truth. He reached into his pocket and picked up the phone. Captain Robert Harris raised the phone to his ear. Robert, the voice on the other end of the line said, low and urgent. What's going on at Harbor Executive? Harris frowned slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned in that tone. Not in his position. There's someone, Harris replied, his eyes still fixed on Alyssa Monroe, trying to board the G800 without proper authorization. There was a very brief silence on the other end of the line. So brief that if you weren't used to listening, you'd miss it. You said Alyssa Monroe, the voice asked again. Harris smirked. Yes, but there's clearly a misunderstanding. Alyssa stood still. She didn't move. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't show any sign of triumph. She just stood there between the lights and the rain, as if ready for the truth to find its way out. Robert, the other man's voice lowered, are you standing in front of the N800AM? Harris glanced at the aircraft's tail number. N800AM. He swallowed hard. Yes, he replied, his voice beginning to lose its certainty. Then the voice slowed. The woman you're stopping is the rightful owner of that plane. The atmosphere felt frozen. Harris stood still. His hand holding the phone trembled slightly. He looked at Alyssa, then at the plane, then back at Alyssa. Impossible, he blurted out as if by reflex. She doesn't, Robert. The voice interrupted this time, impatiently. The contract is complete. The registration records have been updated with the FAA. There's no mistake. Harris opened his mouth, then closed it again. Alyssa took one step forward. Just one step, but it was enough to draw all eyes to her. Captain Harris, she said, her voice strangely calm. I told you you'd get the call. Harris put down the phone. His face was noticeably pale. Sweat mixed with rainwater clung to his forehead. Ma'am, he said, his voice changing completely. I'm sorry. This was a misunderstanding. Alyssa didn't answer immediately. She looked at him. For a long time, not to savor the moment, but to understand where that apology comes from. From a realization of a mistake, or from a newly emerged fear. What are you apologizing for? She asked. Harris was flustered. Because I delayed you. Alyssa shook her head very slightly. No, she said. He apologized for being caught in the act. Those words came down like a cold, sharp cut. One ground staff member took a slight breath. Another bowed his head. Harris blushed. He was about to say something, but Alyssa spoke up first. He didn't check the records, she said. He didn't call to confirm. He relied on his intuition to decide who got to board the plane. She paused for a moment, and he calls that security. Harris clenched his fists. You have to understand, he said, trying to regain his composure in this industry. We have to be very careful. Alyssa nodded. That's right, she said. That's why you absolutely shouldn't rely on prejudice. She turned her head to look towards the airplane stairs. Then, she turned back to Harris. Now, she said you have two choices. Harris swallowed hard. First, Alyssa continued, he could apologize, publicly admit his mistake, and let me board the plane. Secondly, she said slowly, you can continue to insist that you are right, and let things be handled at a higher level. Harris looked at her, his gaze wavering. 30 years of his career flashed through his mind. Long flights, handshakes, times he'd been called the reliable captain. Are you threatening me? He asked. Alyssa shook her head. I'm giving him a chance, she said. Just like nobody gave me a chance when I walked into this room. A long silence followed. Then Harris chuckled softly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Do you think just because you bought an airplane, he said, his voice sharp, you can teach me how to do the job? Alyssa looked at him, her eyes filled with more sadness than anger. I'm not teaching you, she replied. I'm taking notes. Record what Harris growled. The way he treated people who weren't like him, Alyssa said, and the way he reacted when his power was challenged. Harris turned away, breathing heavily. Security, he said loudly again. Get her out of this area. 2 security guards approached. Slowly, hesitantly. Alyssa didn't move. She looked straight at them. I am Alyssa Monroe, she stated clearly. I am the legal owner of this aircraft. The 2 security guards looked at Harris. Harris nodded vigorously. Go ahead and do it, he said. At that moment, it was no longer a misunderstanding. It became a public insult. Alyssa sensed it very clearly, not with her mind, but with her body. The way everyone around her was silent. The way their eyes avoided hers. She thought of the viewers who would hear this story later. People who had been taken from the space where they belonged simply because someone wasn't comfortable. She inhaled. Then she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Captain Harris, he said, you have just refused a lawful order, and you are doing so in front of witnesses. Harris returned. You're overreacting, he snapped. No, Alyssa replied. I'm clarifying. She turned to the 2 security guards. I don't blame you, she said. You're just following orders. The 2 looked at each other. One bowed their head very slightly. Alyssa turned back to look at Harris one last time. That phone call, she said, was just the first step. Harris gave a wry smile. I'm not afraid. Alyssa nodded. I know, she said. People who believe they are always right are usually not afraid. She took out her phone, opened an app, taped lightly. But you will learn. Alyssa said, her voice still calm, that the truth doesn't need you to believe it. It just needs time. In the distance, a black sedan pulled up in front of the administration building. The door opened. A man in a suit stepped out and walked away quickly. Harris didn't realize it yet, but Alyssa does. She looked in that direction, and know that the first wave has begun to crash against the shore. Alyssa Monroe stood still. It wasn't because she was stopped by 2 security guards. They hadn't touched her. In fact, they didn't know what to do next. She stood still because she chose to stand still. In the middle of the rain-soaked runway, where the yellow lights stretched into long, hazy streaks on the concrete, Alyssa felt time slow down. Every sound seemed more distant. The hum of the Gulfstream G800's auxiliary engine now sounded like a steady, patient breath. She was used to moments like these. Moments when the entire room or the entire space seemed to be waiting for her reaction. They waited for her to get angry, or cry, or say something that would make them nod in agreement. See, she's just like I thought. Alyssa didn't give them that. She looked down at her hands. They were normal, not trembling, not clenched, just resting lightly at her sides, like when she stood in front of the mirror each morning, reminding herself, today, I will not become a smaller version of myself. She recalled an evening many years ago, when Monroe Analytics was still unknown in the news. She sat alone in her makeshift office in South Loop, Chicago. It was snowing heavily. She had just been rejected by an investment fund. The reason they gave was polite. We're not sure you're capable of leading this team. Alyssa sat in the darkness for a long time. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there and asked herself one question. If I give up, who will I become? The answer came quickly. She would become someone who had accepted how others defined her. And Alyssa knew that was the only thing she couldn't do. A drop of rain fell on the back of her hand, icy cold. She looked up. Captain Robert Harris was still standing there. His back slightly turned, saying something to the security officer. His voice was low, hurried, and somewhat irritated. He wasn't looking at her. There was a very human moment where Alyssa felt tired. It's not the insults that are tiring, but the constant need to be strong. She thought of the other black women she had met at the conferences. The hurried hugs in the hallways. The quiet, but heavy whispers. How do you keep from going crazy? Have you ever wanted to give it all up? Alyssa always answered very honestly. Yes, but I don't allow myself to stop there. Standing in the middle of the runway, she wondered, who am I doing this for? For herself, or for all the people who wouldn't have the chance to stand here if she stepped back? She didn't have an answer right away, and she allowed herself to have no answer. That's something she's allowed in a very long time. A luggage cart rolled past, in the distance, its wheels clattering. A ground staff member glanced at her, then quickly turned away. Not out of contempt, but out of fear of getting involved. Alyssa understands that feeling. She used to be the one standing outside, looking into the rooms of power, wondering whether she should step inside. She doesn't blame them. She criticized the system that had taught people that silence was the safest way to survive. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand again. This time it was a short message from Daniel Brooks, the interim chief operating officer of Monroe Analytics. We're monitoring. Are you okay? After reading it, Alyssa didn't reply immediately. She knew Daniel was worried. Not about the plane, but about her. He was one of the very few people who had ever seen her cry. Only once, after a deal fell through because of unofficial concerns. Alyssa typed a short message, I'm fine. Just let things happen. She put away her phone. There's a little-known fact about Alyssa Monroe. She didn't like winning by embarrassing others. She doesn't like noisy betrayals. She believed in consequences rather than punishment. And that's why for her this moment wasn't the time to raise her voice. It was the time to observe. Captain Harris turned around. He took a few steps toward her. His voice was lower, but still tense. We can resolve this amicably, he said. There's no need to make a big deal out of it. Alyssa looked at him. Her gaze was no longer sharp, but somber. What do you consider peaceful? She asked. Harris hesitated. You get on the plane. We'll pretend nothing happened. Alyssa nodded slowly. And next time, she continued, when someone like me walks in here, what will you do? Harris remained silent. That question wasn't in his script. Will you rely on your gut feeling again? Alyssa asked. Or will you check the records? Harris breathed heavily. I'm not a bad person, he said, as if to justify himself. Alyssa nodded. I know, she replied. But good people in a bad system can still cause harm. That remark made Harris frown. He wasn't used to being put in a position where he had to think about the consequences of his actions in that way. Alyssa turned to look at the plane one more time. She had dreamed of this moment. Not the moment of being stopped, but the moment of stepping onto her own plane, knowing she had come a long way. She never imagined that even here she would have to stand still to prove her existence. A very subtle sadness crept into her heart. It didn't break her down. It was just enough to remind her that the world hadn't changed as quickly as she had hoped. But then another thought emerged. Calmer, clearer. If I do nothing here, Alyssa thought, then I'm accepting that this is normal. And that she couldn't do. She turned to look at Harris. Captain Harris, she said, her voice softening but firm, I will board the plane. But not in the way you suggest. Harris frowned. What do you mean? We'll let everything be fully documented, Alyssa replied. Not as punishment, but so that no one has to stand in this position again. Harris opened his mouth to object. But just then, the man in the suit stepped out of the black sedan and approached. He was breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the scene before him. Dr. Monroe, he said, his voice tense but respectful. I apologize for the delay. Alyssa returned. She recognized him, and in that moment she knew the silence was over. The man in the suit stopped a few steps away from Alyssa Monroe. He was in his early 40s, tall and thin, his tie not yet straightened. His forehead was dotted with sweat, whether from the rain or from rushing was unclear. His eyes quickly glanced at Captain Robert Harris, the two security officers, then returned to Alyssa. Dr. Monroe. He repeated this time more slowly, as if to ensure he was using the correct form of address. I am Michael Turner, Regional Managing Director of Harbor Executive. Alyssa nodded. Hello, Mr. Turner. Her voice was calm, devoid of any hint of triumph. Just a polite greeting. Michael Turner Quay, sang Harris. Captain, he said, his voice low but firm, I've been told there's a serious problem here. Harris stood up straight, a familiar reflex of someone accustomed to being judged by their posture. We're dealing with a security situation, Harris replied. There's been a mix-up in passenger identities. Turner observed him intently. No rush, no interrupting. Has the misunderstanding been cleared up? Turner asked. Harris hesitated. We are clarifying. Turner Quay sang Alyssa. Dr. Monroe, he said, first of all, allow me to apologize on behalf of the harbor executive. Harris spun around. Michael Turner raised his hand, signaling to stop. No, he said. Let me finish. He turned back towards Alyssa. We have confirmed, Turner continued, that she is the legal owner of the Gulfstream G800 with registration number N800AM. Alyssa showed no emotion. She simply nodded slightly, as if it were the most natural thing to do. And Turner continued, his voice heavier. She was prevented from boarding the plane without valid grounds. A silence spread. The two security guards looked down at the ground. One of them swallowed. Harris opened his mouth. Michael, I told you Captain Harris. Turner interrupted. I'm not asking about your intentions. I'm asking about the process. Harris stood frozen. Did you check the ownership records? Turner asked. Not yet, Harris replied, his voice low. Did you get confirmation from the operations department? Harris shook his head. Do you have any evidence to suggest that Dr. Monroe was not entitled to board the plane? Harris remained silent. Turner exhaled. A long breath. Then, he said, this is no longer a mistake. He turned to Alyssa. Dr. Monroe, Turner said, would you like to continue the flight now? We can rearrange the crew if necessary. The question was uttered softly, but its impact was undeniable. Harris looked at Turner, then at Alyssa. His gaze wavered. For the first time since the beginning, Alyssa saw a clear crack in his confidence. Alyssa didn't answer immediately. She looked at Turner, then at Harris, then at the plane. There was a very strange feeling in her heart. Not gloating, rather, a heavy feeling. Power, when placed in your hands, doesn't always feel pleasant. Before I answer, Alyssa said slowly, I want to ask you a question, Mr. Turner. Yes, Turner replied. What would happen if I weren't the owner of this plane today? Alyssa asked. Turner paused. He looked at her, then at Harris. That question wasn't part of any of the established procedures. I want to know. Alyssa continued, her voice still soft, whether your system protects those who lack power like I do. Turner was silent for a few seconds. Then he sighed. Frankly, he replied, our system is only good because the people who operate it choose to use it. Alyssa nodded. Thank you for your honesty. She turned to Harris. Captain Harris, Alyssa said, do you know what annoys me the most? Harris looked at her but didn't answer. It's not about him stopping me, Alyssa continued. It's about him believing he has the right to decide who belongs here. Harris clenched his jaw. I've been flying for 30 years, he said. I've kept many people safe. Alyssa looked at him, her gaze softening. I believe that, she said. But safety doesn't include excluding people based on feelings. She turned back to Turner. He asked me if I wanted to continue the flight, Alyssa said. My answer was yes. Harris breathed a sigh of relief. But Alyssa wasn't finished yet. But not right now. Harris looked up. What do you mean? Turner asked. Alyssa inhaled. I want everything that happened here to be documented, she said. I want an official record of this incident. Turner nodded immediately. We will make a full record, he said. And Alyssa continued, I want to know the procedure for dealing with a pilot who refuses a lawful order from the aircraft owner. The atmosphere became tense again. Harris Quay sang Turner. Michael, he said, his voice somewhat sharp, she's making a big deal out of it. Alyssa looked directly at Harris. No, she said. I'm doing the right thing. Turner didn't answer Harris immediately. He turned to Alyssa. Dr. Monroe, he said, according to regulations, refusing a lawful order without justification may result in disciplinary action. Harris turned pale. What kind of discipline? Alyssa asked. Turner paused for a moment. This could include flight suspensions during the investigation. A cold wind blew through. Harris took a step back, almost unconsciously. This is ridiculous, he said. Just because of a misunderstanding, Captain Turner interrupted. We've moved past the stage of calling this a misunderstanding. Alyssa sensed the change in the atmosphere. Not because she spoke loudly, but because the truth had finally taken root. She thought back to all the times before when her truth wasn't credible enough to be heard. And she knew this moment wasn't just for herself. Mr. Turner, Alyssa said, I'm not here to take anyone's job. Harris looked up. I came here. She continued to make sure that no one else has to stand in the rain, being asked to prove their existence. Turner looked at her, his gaze a mixture of respect and thoughtfulness. We will handle this seriously, he said. Alyssa nodded. Then I'll wait. Where would you like to wait? Turner asked. Alyssa looked towards the operator. Then she looked back at the plane. Right here, she said. I want everything to happen in front of everyone. Harris bowed his head. Not out of respect, but because he had no other choice. Turner signaled to the security guard. No one is to ask Dr. Monroe to leave this area, he said. She's our guest. The two employees nodded immediately. Alyssa stood still. The rain had lessened. The light reflected off her face, revealing her weariness, but also highlighting something else. Stability. She knew that from this moment on things would no longer be simple. Power has emerged, and when true power emerges, it doesn't stop at one person. It started affecting the entire system. The silence on the runway didn't last long. It was broken not by a shout or a new command, but by phone calls. Michael Turner's phone rang first. Then the security staff's walkie-talkie. Another streetcar pulled up nearby. Two people in executive jackets got out walking and looking toward Alyssa Monroe as if trying to piece her image together with the information they had just received. Alyssa stood still. She didn't need to move forward. She didn't need to assert anything further. From the moment Michael Turner called her by her proper name and title, the matter had transcended the realm of a personal dispute. It became an organizational problem. Turner turned a few steps back from Alyssa, lowering his voice as he spoke on the phone. But in the vast emptiness of the runway, every word still reached the ears of those standing nearby. Yes. Confirmed with the FAA. Records updated at 6:12 p. No legal dispute. Captain Robert Harris stood slightly to one side. He was no longer blocking the way to the plane. His shoulders were noticeably slumped, as if he had just taken on a weight he was not used to carrying. A young ground staff member approached Alyssa cautiously. Dr. Monroe, he whispered, would you like to come inside the control room to avoid the rain? Alyssa looked at him. She recognized that look, not the look of fear, but the look of someone beginning to re-examine what they once considered normal. Thank you, she replied. But I'm fine here. The employee nodded and stepped back. Before turning away, he added very softly, I'm sorry for what you had to go through. Alyssa didn't answer immediately. Only when he had gone a few steps did she speak, just loud enough for him to hear, thank you for telling me. That statement wasn't just for him. It was for everyone standing around, everyone who had been silent for far too long. On the other side of the runway, in the control room, the atmosphere had completely changed. An emergency meeting was convened in less than 10 minutes. Those accustomed to handling flight schedules, fuel, and paperwork were now confronted with a much bigger question. How did this happen? Michael Turner walked into the small conference room, phone still pressed to his ear. He gestured for everyone to wait, then finished his sentence. No, I don't think this is a personal incident. I think it's a procedural issue. He hung up the phone. He turned to the management team. We have a problem, Turner said, and it's not on the runway. An older man who had been in charge of operations for many years frowned. It was just a misunderstanding with a particular passenger, he said. We can settle this internally. Turner shook his head. No, he replied. That's how we've handled things like this for years. The room was silent. And today, Turner continued, that's exactly what brought us here. Meanwhile, outside, Alyssa Monroe clearly sensed the invisible movement spreading out. Her phone vibrated incessantly. Text from Daniel Brooks. An email from Monroe Analytics Legal Department. A brief notification from her personal assistant. Alyssa didn't open it right away. She looked at the Gulfstream G800. She noticed how the people around her now avoided her gaze not out of contempt, but because they were wondering what they had overlooked. She recalled a question she often asked herself whenever she faced a major decision. If I do nothing, what will be the long-term consequences? She knew the answer this time. If she were to board the plane and fly away, everything could be handled internally. A reminder, a training session, an apology email, and then next time there will be someone else standing in the rain. Alyssa couldn't accept that. Michael Turner turned to face her. His face looked more tired than it had a few minutes earlier, but also more serious. Dr. Monroe, he said, we have reported the matter to the senior management of Harbor Executive. Alyssa nodded. They'll want to speak to her. Turner continued. Maybe tonight. Okay, Alyssa replied. I'm ready. Turner looked at her, hesitating slightly. There's one more thing, he said. Captain Harris has been asked to temporarily step down from his position as commander of this flight. Alyssa turned to look at Harris. He stood a few steps away, his eyes fixed on the ground. Gone was the confidence, gone was the defiance. Just a man trying to comprehend what had just happened to him. Alyssa felt a very strange emotion welling up inside her. Not victory, but sadness. She was saddened because she knew Harris wasn't the only one who behaved that way. And she wasn't the first to face the consequences either. Mr. Harris, Alyssa said, her voice not loud, but loud enough for him to hear. Harris looked up. I'm not happy about this, she said, but I hope he'll think about it. Harris didn't reply. He just nodded very slightly. Turner cleared his throat. We're sending another crew, he said. It will take about 90 minutes. Alyssa glanced at her watch. Time wasn't an issue. At least not right now. While we wait, she said, I'd like to know something. Turner looked at her. How many complaints like this, Alyssa asked, have ever been resolved without a trace? Turner remained silent. That question doesn't need an immediate answer. It's like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that gradually spread. In another corner of the airport, Captain Harris was escorted into a small room. Not a cell, but not a place he was familiar with either. He sat down in a chair looking at his hands. 30 years. He had been flying for 30 years. And in just one evening, his familiar world began to crack. In the Harbor Executive's meeting room, old emails were sifted through. Reports previously categorized as processed were reopened. One name appeared more than once. Robert Harris. Turner stared at the screen, his heart heavy. What have we missed, he wondered. Outside, Alyssa Monroe finally answered her phone. Daniel Brooks called. Alyssa, he said, his voice low. People are asking if you need the legal team involved. Alyssa looked at the plane, then at the sky where the rain had subsided. Not yet, she replied. Let's see what they choose to do first. Daniel was silent for a few seconds. You're carrying more than just one flight, he said. Alyssa smiled very slightly. You know, she said, I didn't choose this, but I won't give it up. She hung up the phone. In the distance, the runway lights shone brighter. Night had truly fallen. But under those lights, Alyssa felt it distinctly. Something had been activated. Quiet, undramatic, but it's irreversible. Alyssa Monroe sat down in the metal chair against the glass wall of the control room, still looking straight out at the runway. She didn't go into the private waiting room. She didn't accept coffee. She didn't change seats. She wanted to stay right where it all began, as a way of reminding herself that the starting point of this problem was very simple. It was just one person blocking another's path. Just a glance. Just a single sentence. You don't belong here. Michael Turner stood a few steps away, constantly communicating with the executive team on the phone. With each call ending, his shoulders slumped a little more. Not because of the pressure from Alyssa, but because of what he was beginning to see behind the scenes. Finally, Turner returned. Dr. Monroe, he said, his voice slower than before, I need you to look through a few things. Alyssa looked up. Here, she asked. Turner nodded. I think she should see it for herself. They entered a small, windowless office. A laptop was open on the desk. Turner pulled out a chair for Alyssa, then sat down opposite her. Over the past 10 years, Turner said, Harbor Executive has handled a considerable number of complaints regarding service attitudes. Alyssa remained silent. For the most part, Turner continued, it's marked as resolved. He turned the screen towards her. A list appeared. Not long, but not short either. Each line represented an event. A day. A short note. Alyssa read slowly. Customers felt they were being subjected to excessive suspicion. The experience did not meet service standards. There were misunderstandings about security procedures. These are very familiar words. Words used to soften a harsh and sharp experience. How many incidents directly involve the denial of access to the aircraft? Alyssa asked. Turner typed a few keys. 7, he replied. Within 6 years. Alyssa looked up. How many of those involved passengers of color? She asked. Turner didn't reply immediately. He looked at the screen. Then he sighed. Year. The room was silent. Alyssa felt a very familiar chill run down her spine. Not in number, but in pattern. 5 out of 7, she repeated. And all of them were marked as resolved. Turner nodded. We usually handle it by offering a private apology, he said. Or by changing the crew for the next flight. Alyssa looked at him. And has anyone been held accountable? She asked. Turner shook his head. Not official. Alyssa closed her eyes for a second. In that moment, many things in her head aligned into a straight line. Not because she was surprised, but because she had once been on the other side of these notes. Meetings end with the phrase, "We'll learn from this." Anonymous apology emails. Vague promises that next time will be different. Was Captain Harris involved in any of these cases? Alyssa asked. Turner hesitated. Then he typed in the search bar. Robert Harris's name came up, not just once, 3 times. Alyssa stared at the number for a long time. 3 out of 5, she said softly. Turner nodded. We dismissed it as a coincidence, he said. He was a veteran pilot, highly regarded. Alyssa leaned back in her chair. Appreciated by whom? She asked. Turner remained silent. That question wasn't directed at him. It was about how an organization tells its own story. Do you know the most dangerous thing about systems like this? Alyssa said. Turner shook his head. They make those who do the right feel like they're overreacting, Alyssa replied. And they make those who do wrong believe they're protected. Turner bowed his head. We believe that if there was no litigation, he said, then there was no problem. Alyssa smiled sadly. No, she said. It just means that those who were hurt chose to remain silent. She stood up and walked towards the door. Through the frosted glass, she saw Captain Harris sitting alone in the next room. He was bowing his head, his hands clasped together. Alyssa didn't look at him for long. She saw something else. A system that had allowed someone like him to exist without question. Michael, Alyssa said, calling Turner by his first name, if I weren't here today, as the owner of this plane. Turner interrupted, his voice hoarse. Then everything will be marked as resolved again. Alyssa nodded. That's the problem. She returned to the table and placed her hand on the cold wooden surface. Do you know why I didn't board the plane immediately when you suggested it? She asked. Turner shook his head. Because I've flown away so many times, Alyssa said, while these things remain. Turner looked at her, his gaze changing. It was no longer just the respect for a powerful client. It was a realization of responsibility. What should we do? He asked. Alyssa didn't answer immediately. She thought of Daniel Brooks. Of the long nights the Monroe analytics team spent deciding not to patch the bug temporarily, but to rewrite the entire codebase. A time-consuming but necessary decision. He needs an independent inspection, Alyssa said. Not to find a scapegoat, but to look straight at the structure. Turner nodded slowly. That would be very noisy, he said. Alyssa looked at him. No, she replied. It will be very quiet and very painful. Turner exhaled. The board will object. The board will object because they're afraid, Alyssa said. But that fear cannot continue to take precedence over safety and dignity. She looked at the list on the screen one last time. These people, she said, pointing to the notes, have been asked to prove that they belong here. She turned to Turner. Today, I'm simply the one who refuses to accept it. Turner nodded slowly but surely. We will do it, he said. I will propose a full audit. Alyssa sat down again. There's one more thing, she said. Turner waited. In the process, Alyssa continued, some people will lose their jobs. Some people will be angry. Some people will say that I'm overreacting. Turner nodded. Are you ready for that? He asked. Alyssa looked out at the runway. The rain had stopped. The concrete surface reflected the lights like a frosted mirror. I've been ready for a long time, she said. It's just that today, someone forced me to use that readiness. Turner stood up. The new crew will arrive in about an hour, he said. But I understand if you want to change your plans. Alyssa shook her head. I'll fly, she replied, but not to escape from this. She stood up and put her coat back on. Michael, she said, this isn't my story. Turner looked at her. This is a story about what we allow to be repeated, Alyssa continued, and what we decide to put an end to. Turner nodded. Outside, the runway lights were still on. But Alyssa knew that the real light was beginning to shine into the dark corners that had long been unseen. And from this moment on, things will never be the same again. Alyssa Monroe remained alone in the small study for a few more minutes after Michael Turner left. The room had no windows. The soft white fluorescent light made everything look flat and real. There was nothing to hide, nothing to conceal. She sat still, her hands resting on her knees, breathing evenly. In her mind, it wasn't the image of Captain Robert Harris, nor the lifeless notes on the screen. What was swirling around her was an old question, but this time heavier than ever. What should I do next? Two paths appeared very clearly. The first path is straightforward. She can call the legal team, she can write an email, she can make it a model case, suspension, press release, public apology, and then fly away. Quick, simple, low risk. That path would break up a few exposed fragments enough to make it look like action had taken place. But Alyssa knew that path. She'd seen it work in so many places. It created a short-term sense of justice, then left the old core alive. The second option is less clear, longer, and more expensive. That path requires reconstruction. It doesn't just ask who is wrong, but it asks, why has this wrong been allowed to persist for so long? Alyssa closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered a time long ago when Monroe Analytics was developing an early gene prediction system. The engineering team had discovered a small error in the training data. They could quickly patch it, or they could revert to the original data source. The team debated late into the night. A quick patch would meet the deadline. Rewriting it would delay things by 3 months. Alyssa said something she would always remember. If we patch it, the error will come back. If we rewrite it, we won't have to apologize for it anymore. She opened her eyes. Out there, the Gulfstream G800 is still waiting. The new crew is on their way. Everything could end quietly. But there was one thing that prevented Alyssa from getting up. She thought of the 5 anonymous names on the complaint list. People who had been marked as resolved. People who might have wondered if they were being too sensitive, if they were seeing something that didn't exist. She thought of the question Michael Turner had avoided earlier. How many things have gone unnoticed? She stood up. Stepping out of the room, Alyssa walked down the narrow corridor leading to the area overlooking the runway. She stopped in front of a large glass panel. Outside, Captain Harris was being escorted past slowly. He didn't look up. Alyssa was neither happy nor satisfied. She saw only one thing clearly: this couldn't be the end. The phone rang. This time, it was Daniel Brooks calling back. Alyssa, Daniel said, his voice low, the legal team is ready. Just tell us. Alyssa looked outside. Daniel, she said, if you were me, what would you do? Daniel was silent for a few seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was slower. If it were me, he said, I would ask whether I wanted to sleep well for a week or for 10 years. Alyssa smiled, very slightly. Thank you, she said. She hung up the phone. Michael Turner returned carrying a thin stack of papers. A preliminary report, he said, and confirmation of Captain Harris's temporary suspension pending investigation. Alyssa took it. She glanced through it quickly. Everything was in order. Just right. Safe enough. Michael, she said, I need you to do one more thing. Turner looked at her, waiting. I want the full list, Alyssa said. All complaints relating to discriminatory behavior, however marked. Turner nodded. We will provide it. Not just at Harbor Executive Airfield, Alyssa continued. I want to see it across the entire system you manage. Turner inhaled. It will be difficult. Alyssa interrupted, her voice still calm. I know. Turner looked at her. His gaze was no longer one of doubt. Only the thoughtfulness of someone who understood they were standing at a turning point remained. How far do you intend to go with this? He asked. Alyssa paused for a moment. The next time, someone who isn't like me, she said, won't have to stand in the rain to prove they belong. Turner nodded. We will need an independent auditing firm, he said. And cooperation from you. Alyssa replied immediately. I will cooperate. Turner hesitated. This won't make her popular, he said. Alyssa looked straight at him. I didn't build my company to be liked, she replied. I built it to last. Turner exhaled as if he had just made an internal decision. Okay, he said. I'll present it to the board tonight. Alyssa nodded. Thank you, sir. When Turner left, Alyssa stood alone once more. She looked at the plane. She could board it any time. But she knew that the most important flight right now wasn't the flight itself. It was a flight through an irreversible decision. She wondered if she was overreacting. Was she placing the burden of reform on a matter that could have been handled neatly? That was a very real question, and Alyssa didn't dismiss it. But then she thought of something else, something equally real. If it wasn't her, then who was it? She has position. She has a voice. She has resources. And most importantly, she has an experience that so many others haven't been heard. Alyssa walked closer to the airplane stairs. She placed her hand on the cold railing. She didn't step up. She just touched it. Not now, she murmured, as if talking to herself. She turned around, facing the operator. In another corner of the room, Captain Harris sat alone. He stared into space. Familiar images were shattering in his mind. He didn't know what would happen next. He only knew that the world he believed to be stable had just shifted. Alyssa felt no pleasure in thinking about that. She only hoped that if this system changed, then those who came after Harris, those like him, and others as well, would no longer have the right to believe that their prejudices were the norm. She walked into the executive office. At the rear, the Gulfstream G800's auxiliary engine shuts off, as if understanding that the journey needs a little longer. And in that waiting period, Alyssa Monroe made her choice. It's not about breaking down to move forward, but about rebuilding so that no one is left behind. Alyssa Monroe knew this moment would come. She just didn't expect it to come so quickly. When the phone rang for the third time in 10 minutes, Alyssa was sitting in the main waiting area of the operator's office, a glass of water untouched in front of her. The white light shone down, making everything look perfectly clear, leaving no room for ambiguity. Daniel Brooks called. Alyssa, he said, as soon as she answered the phone, the story's out. Alyssa closed her eyes for a second. How do we get out? She asked. Not complete, Daniel replied. And not fair. She opened her eyes. I'll send it to you to see. Less than 10 seconds later, a link appeared on the screen. Alyssa clicked on it. A blog page appeared. Simple design. Large, bold, and attention-grabbing headline. Tech CEO causes disruption at private airport. Veteran pilot suspended after security controversy. Alyssa reads slowly. The article makes no mention of the sales contract. It makes no mention of FAA records. It makes no mention of the complaint history. Instead, the words are very familiar. Arguments, misunderstandings, overreactions, pressure from wealthy people. Her name appeared a few times, but not as the owner. Rather, she was referred to as the controversial female tech CEO. Daniel continued, his voice lowering. Captain Harris has spoken to the press. Alyssa let out a soft sigh. What did he say? That he was just doing his job, Daniel replied. That there were legitimate security concerns. And that he was suspended for not accommodating a passenger in a position of authority. Alyssa remained silent. It wasn't because she was surprised. It was because she had seen this script too many times before. When old power is challenged, it often doesn't react by looking back. It reacts by telling the story in a way that benefits itself. Have the major media arrived yet? Alyssa asked. Not yet, Daniel replied. But social media is starting to talk about it. Alyssa scrolled down to the comments section. There were lines that were painfully familiar to her. It's probably just reverse discrimination. The pilot did the right thing, but got punished. Money can buy everything. She turned off the screen. Alyssa, Daniel said we need a response. Alyssa looked up, gazing out at the runway. It was completely dark. The spotlights formed separate circular patches of light like stories that didn't touch each other. We will respond, she said. But not in the way they expect. Daniel remained silent, waiting. I don't want to argue about every detail, Alyssa continued. I don't want to debate who's right and who's wrong in the headlines. So what do you want? Daniel asked. I want the truth to speak for itself, she replied. Daniel inhaled. That means transparency, Alyssa interrupted. Complete. Elsewhere in the airport, Captain Robert Harris sat at a small table, a phone in front of him. He had just finished a short phone interview. The person on the other end thanked him and promised to bring the story to light. Harris felt both relieved and angry. He didn't think he had done anything wrong. The image was still vivid in his mind. A man unlike any he had ever served appearing in a place that demanded high discipline. He believed he had acted on professional instinct, and now he's being turned into the villain. That's not fair, he muttered. He didn't know that on the other side Alyssa Monroe was also facing something very familiar, a story being retold without the context of the less fortunate. Michael Turner called Alyssa shortly afterward. "Dr. Monroe," he said, his voice tense. "We're being bombarded with questions from the media." Alyssa nodded, even though she knew Turner couldn't see. "How do you intend to answer?" she asked. "The board wants to issue a brief statement," Turner said, "that the matter is under investigation, and we have no further comment." Alyssa was silent for a few seconds. "Michael," she said, "do you remember what we talked about marking it?" "Resolved," Turner exhaled. "Have." A vague statement, Alyssa said, "is how everything gets buried." Turner remained silent. "Are you prepared to make this story a little more challenging?" Alyssa asked. "How difficult is it?" Turner replied. "It's so difficult," Alyssa said slowly, "that we don't have complete control over how other people react." Turner swallowed. "What do you propose?" Alyssa stood up, took a few steps, then stopped. "The audit is being released," she said. "Not the final results, but the fact that it's happening." Turner froze. "Now?" he asked. "Now," Alyssa confirmed. "Before someone else writes our story for us." Turner was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different. "This will cause panic on the board of directors." Alyssa looked straight ahead. "Sometimes," she said, "panic is a sign that we've been avoiding the issue for too long." Turner exhaled. "Okay," he said. "I'll propose it." After hanging up, Alyssa sat down. She felt the pressure weighing heavily on her shoulders. Not the pressure of public opinion, but the pressure of not being allowed to make a mistake. If she goes too fast, she'll be called an extremist. If she goes too slowly, everything will be diluted. She thought of her mother. Those evenings, when her mother came home late exhausted, but still sat and listened to Alyssa talk about school. Her mother used to say, "You don't have to please everyone. You just need to not betray what you know is right." Alyssa opened her laptop. She wrote a very short draft. No unnecessary emotion. No attacks, just the truth. Harbor Executive has confirmed it is conducting an independent review of its security and service procedures following an incident at Harbor Executive Airport. The review aims to ensure all passengers are treated fairly, respectfully, and according to established procedures regardless of who they are. She paused. Another line. "We understand that transparency may cause discomfort in the short term, but it is the only way to build long-term trust." Alyssa sent the draft to Turner and Daniel. Then she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Somewhere out there the story is spreading, being distorted, being debated. But Alyssa knew that from this moment on, it was no longer just her story. It became a test, and that test no one can avoid anymore. Alyssa Monroe knew this moment would come. She just didn't expect it to come so quickly. When the phone rang for the third time in 10 minutes, Alyssa was sitting in the main waiting area of the operator's office, a glass of water untouched in front of her. The white light shone down, making everything look perfectly clear, leaving no room for ambiguity. Daniel Brooks called. "Alyssa," he said, as soon as she answered the phone, "the story's out." Alyssa closed her eyes for a second. "How do we get out?" she asked. "Not complete," Daniel replied. "And not fair." She opened her eyes. "I'll send it to you to see." Less than 10 seconds later, a link appeared on the screen. Alyssa clicked on it. A blog page appeared. Simple design. Large, bold, and attention-grabbing headline: Tech CEO causes disruption at private airport. Veteran pilot suspended after security controversy. Alyssa reads slowly. The article makes no mention of the sales contract. It makes no mention of FAA records. It makes no mention of the complaint history. Instead, the words are very familiar. Arguments, misunderstandings, overreactions, pressure from wealthy people. Her name appeared a few times, but not as the owner. Rather, she was referred to as the controversial female tech CEO. Daniel continued, his voice lowering. "Captain Harris has spoken to the press." Alyssa let out a soft sigh. "What did he say?" "That he was just doing his job," Daniel replied. "That there were legitimate security concerns, and that he was suspended for not accommodating a passenger in a position of authority." Alyssa remained silent. It wasn't because she was surprised. It was because she had seen this script too many times before. When old power is challenged, it often doesn't react by looking back. It reacts by telling the story in a way that benefits itself. Have the major media arrived yet? Alyssa asked. Not yet, Daniel replied. But social media is starting to talk about it. Alyssa scrolled down to the comments section. There were lines that were painfully familiar to her. It's probably just reverse discrimination. The pilot did the right thing, but got punished. Money can buy everything. She turned off the screen. Alyssa, Daniel said, "We need a response." Alyssa looked up, gazing out at the runway. It was completely dark. The spotlights formed separate circular patches of light like stories that didn't touch each other. "We will respond," she said, "but not in the way they expect." Daniel remained silent, waiting. "I don't want to argue about every detail," Alyssa continued. "I don't want to debate who's right and who's wrong in the headlines." "So what do you want?" Daniel asked. "I want the truth to speak for itself," she replied. Daniel inhaled. "That means transparency," Alyssa interrupted. "Complete." Elsewhere, in the airport, Captain Robert Harris sat at a small table, a phone in front of him. He had just finished a short phone interview. The person on the other end thanked him and promised to bring the story to light. Harris felt both relieved and angry. He didn't think he had done anything wrong. The image was still vivid in his mind, a man unlike any he had ever served appearing in a place that demanded high discipline. He believed he had acted on professional instinct, and now he's being turned into the villain. "That's not fair," he muttered. He didn't know that, on the other side, Alyssa Monroe was also facing something very familiar, a story being retold without the context of the less fortunate. Michael Turner called Alyssa shortly afterward. "Dr. Monroe," he said, his voice tense. "We're being bombarded with questions from the media." Alyssa nodded, even though she knew Turner couldn't see. "How do you intend to answer?" she asked. "The board wants to issue a brief statement," Turner said. "That the matter is under investigation, and we have no further comment." Alyssa was silent for a few seconds. "Michael," she said, "do you remember what we talked about marking it resolved?" Turner exhaled. "Have." "A vague statement," Alyssa said, "is how everything gets buried." Turner remained silent. "Are you prepared to make this story a little more challenging?" Alyssa asked. "How difficult is it?" Turner replied. "It's so difficult." Alyssa said slowly, "that we don't have complete control over how other people react." Turner swallowed. "What do you propose?" Alyssa stood up, took a few steps, then stopped. "The audit is being released," she said. "Not the final results, but the fact that it's happening." Turner froze. "Now?" he asked. "Now," Alyssa confirmed. "Before someone else writes our story for us." Turner was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different. "This will cause panic on the board of directors." Alyssa looked straight ahead. "Sometimes," she said, "panic is a sign that we've been avoiding the issue for too long." Turner exhaled. "Okay," he said. "I'll propose it." After hanging up, Alyssa sat down. She felt the pressure weighing heavily on her shoulders. Not the pressure of public opinion, but the pressure of not being allowed to make a mistake. If she goes too fast, she'll be called an extremist. If she goes too slowly, everything will be diluted. She thought of her mother. Those evenings, when her mother came home late, exhausted, but still sat and listened to Alyssa talk about school. Her mother used to say, "You don't have to please everyone. You just need to not betray what you know is right." Alyssa opened her laptop. She wrote a very short draft. No unnecessary emotion, no attacks, just the truth. Harbor Executive has confirmed it is conducting an independent review of its security and service procedures following an incident at Harbor Executive Airport. The review aims to ensure all passengers are treated fairly, respectfully, and according to established procedures, regardless of who they are. She paused. Another line. "We understand that transparency may cause discomfort in the short term, but it is the only way to build long-term trust." Alyssa sent the draft to Turner and Daniel. Then she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Somewhere out there, the story is spreading, being distorted, being debated. But Alyssa knew that from this moment on, it was no longer just her story. It became a test, and that test no one can avoid anymore. The story took an unexpected turn. Not through an official statement, not through a press conference, but through an audio clip. Alyssa Monroe was sitting in her car on her way out of Harbor Executive Airfield when Daniel Brooks called. His voice was different from usual. Not tense, not hurried, but something hard to describe. "Alyssa," Daniel said, you need to hear this. He sent an audio file. Alyssa put on her headphones and pressed play. At first, it was just the sound of a gentle breeze and metal clanging together, probably from a crew quarters. Then a familiar voice rang out, Captain Robert Harris. To be honest, Harris said his voice tired, but relaxed people are overly sensitive these days. I heard someone chuckle softly from behind. I mean, Harris continued in 30 years of flying. I can tell at a glance who belongs here and who doesn't. Alyssa closed her eyes. She came out of somewhere dressed like someone strolling in the park. Harris continued and said it was her plane. I don't care if she has money or not. She didn't look like someone who owned one. Another voice chimed in, sounding younger. Do you think you've gone too far? The man asked. Harris laughed. Going too far, he replied. I've kept so many flights safe. And now, what? Just because people don't want to be judged. The recording stopped. Alyssa took off her headphones very slowly. She wasn't shocked, not angry, just a very familiar feeling. The truth finally didn't need her to defend it anymore. Where is this passage from? She asked. Someone on the crew recorded it, Daniel said. They sent it anonymously to a journalist. Alyssa leaned her head back against the chair. Which journalist? She asked. An investigator specializing in organizational culture, Daniel replied. He's verifying it. Alyssa looked out the car window. The streetlights drifted by slowly. We did nothing, she said. Daniel hesitated. What I mean is, don't interfere, Alyssa continued. No further comment. No reaction. Daniel was silent for a few seconds. Are you sure? He asked. Alyssa nodded, even though he couldn't see. There are times, she said, when my reaction only dilutes the truth. Elsewhere in the city, Captain Harris was sitting in front of a small TV in his apartment. He held a glass of wine, his eyes glued to the screen. A local news program is playing excerpts from that very recording. I've been flying for 30 years. I can tell a person just by looking at them. Harris turned pale. He jumped to his feet, knocking the glass of wine over onto the floor. The dark red liquid spread, soaking into the carpet. No, he mumbled. That's not it. His phone vibrated. Text messages. Missed calls. The names of people he knew began to appear, then disappeared. He called back an old colleague. Did you hear? Harris asked, his voice urgent. There was silence for a few seconds on the other end of the line. I heard, the other man replied. Robert, this isn't right. They're editing it, Harris said quickly. They're turning me into, no. The other man interrupted. They're just repeating what you said. The call has ended. Harris slumped into his chair. 30 years of building an image. 30 years of trust. And now just a few minutes of sound have brought everything down. In Harbor Executive's office, Michael Turner stood in front of a large screen where a recording was being played back during an emergency meeting. Nobody said anything. No one can. We can't defend this, a board member said, his voice low. Turner nodded. No, he replied. And we shouldn't either. Another person exhaled. We've ignored too many signs. Turner looked back at the list of complaints. 3 involved Harris. Now they were no longer just lifeless words. They have voices. They have attitudes. They have context. What are we going to do? Someone asked. Turner looked straight ahead. We're going to let the audit go all the way, he said. And we're not going to interfere. In another corner of the city, Alyssa Monroe was sitting alone in her hotel room. She wasn't watching TV. She wasn't browsing social media. She brewed a cup of tea, sits down in a chair, watches the steam rise. There was a strange feeling in her heart. Not victory, but a sense of lightness. She thought of all the times she'd had to explain that she wasn't making things up. That those stares, those questions, those doubts were real. And now, without her saying another word, the truth has spoken itself. The phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Thank you, ma'am. I used to be on that list. Alyssa stared at the words for a long time. She didn't answer immediately. Then there's another piece of news. I never thought I'd see this day. Alyssa put the phone down. She didn't need to reply to each person individually. What mattered was that they no longer felt alone. Daniel Brooks sent a short message. The major media outlets have gotten involved. The tone is changing. Alyssa closed her eyes. Somewhere, Captain Harris was sitting alone in his dimly lit apartment. He stared into space, asking himself a question he had never allowed himself to consider before. Have I been confusing experience with prejudice? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, and perhaps he'll have to live with it for a very long time. Alyssa Monroe stood up and walked out onto the balcony. The city below was still noisy and indifferent, but she knew that in its hidden corners something had changed, not because she won, but because the truth finally has been heard. And when the truth speaks, no one can pretend not to hear anymore. The final decision was made on a very ordinary morning. There were no reporters, no cameras, no one standing in front of the building holding a sign. Only one internal email was sent out at 8:17 a.m. Following a review of the independent audit report by Northbridge Compliance Group, the harbor executive has decided to terminate Captain Robert Harris's employment effective immediately. Michael Turner read the email 3 times before pressing the send button. He had prepared for this moment. But when it actually happened, his chest still felt heavy. It wasn't because he regretted losing an individual. Rather, he understood clearly that this wasn't an easy decision, nor was it the final one. In a small apartment on the west side of the city, Captain Robert Harris sat at his dining table, his laptop open. He read the email very slowly. No offensive language. No moral judgments. Just a cold routine line. 30 years. 30 years are summarized in a paragraph of less than 200 words. Harris closed his eyes. Familiar images flashed through his mind: early mornings on the runway, engine checks in the cold wind, confident nods as passengers boarded the plane. He believed he was the one who maintained order, but now he was forced to confront another possibility. Perhaps he had confused order with power. His phone rang. A message from the pilots' union. "We've reviewed the file. Your case is very difficult." Harris put the phone down. No one yelled at him, calling him a bad person. No one cursed at him on television. There was only a long, drawn-out silence, and a future that was no longer clearly defined. At Harbor Executive, the board met behind closed doors. One person suggested they quickly end this story. Another said they needed to protect their reputation. Michael Turner listened to everything. Then, he said something that silenced the room. Reputation is not something we protect by remaining silent. No one objected. They knew that from this moment on, harbor executives couldn't go back to their old ways. Not because they were afraid of the media, but because they had seen themselves in the mirror. On the same day, another letter was sent. This time, it was from the legal department. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, has confirmed it has launched an independent review of security procedures and crew decision-making authority at several private airports, including Harbor Executive. There are no immediate penalties, no hasty conclusions. One thing is very clear: this issue is no longer confined within the 4 walls of a company. Alyssa Monroe received the news while sitting in her New York office at Monroe Analytics. She had just finished a long product strategy meeting. When Daniel Brooks walked in, she had a hunch. "They fired him," Daniel said. Alyssa nodded. She didn't ask for any further details. "The FAA has also gotten involved," Daniel continued. Alyssa leaned back in her chair. "I know," she said. Daniel looked at her, hesitating. "Do you find it burdensome?" he asked. Alyssa thought for a few seconds. "Yes," she replied, "but not because of the outcome." Daniel waited. "I feel burdened because," Alyssa said slowly, "I know there are so many people who only start to change when they have no other choice." Daniel nodded. "Are you worried we've gone too far?" he asked. Alyssa looked at him. "If going too far means there's no turning back," she said, "then I think I've gone far enough." She stood up and walked to the window. The city below was still bustling. Commuters, taxis, lived on, unaware that somewhere a system was being forced to rewrite itself. Alyssa's phone rang. An email from Michael Turner. "We have begun reviewing the entire pilot evaluation and decision-making process. This will be a lengthy process." Alyssa answered briefly. "Thank you for not stopping at the easiest decision." She added nothing more. In a small cafe near the airport, a young ground staff member sat reading the news on his phone. He had stood there that night, witnessing Alyssa Monroe being stopped. He had bowed his head, saying nothing. Now he's reading the news about Captain Harris's dismissal, about the audit, about the FAA. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt relieved. It was as if something that had once weighed heavily on his chest had now been given its proper name. In his apartment, Harris opened an old drawer. Inside was his first flight badge, its edges frayed. He held it up for a long time. He thought about all the times he had said, "I know how to judge people." He had never asked himself, "What if I'm wrong?" Now he no longer has a cockpit to return to. Only one question remains for him to carry with him. Can he become a different person now that his old role is gone? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, and no one owes him an answer. Alyssa Monroe finished her workday later than usual. Before leaving the office, she paused for a moment, gazing at the empty conference room. She thought about all the difficult decisions a leader has to make. Decisions that don't get applause. Decisions where there are no winners. She knew the price of changing the system wasn't just lost positions. It was sleepless nights, strained relationships, whispers behind her back. But she also knew something else equally obvious: not making any changes is actually much more expensive. When Alyssa turned off the lights and left the office, she didn't feel like she had just defeated anyone. She just felt like she had done something that no one else had been willing to do for too long. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the Harbor Executive, other people were beginning to understand that the law of cause and effect doesn't need to be screamed. It just needs to be allowed to happen. The final decision was made on a very ordinary morning. There were no reporters, no cameras, no one standing in front of the building holding a sign. Only one internal email was sent out at 8:17 a.m. Following a review of the independent audit report by Northbridge Compliance Group, the Harbor Executive has decided to terminate Captain Robert Harris's employment effective immediately. Michael Turner read the email 3 times before pressing the send button. He had prepared for this moment. But when it actually happened, his chest still felt heavy. It wasn't because he regretted losing an individual. Rather, he understood clearly that this wasn't an easy decision, nor was it the final one. In a small apartment on the west side of the city, Captain Robert Harris sat at his dining table, his laptop open. He read the email very slowly. No offensive language. No moral judgments. Just a cold routine line. 30 years. 30 years are summarized in a paragraph of less than 200 words. Harris closed his eyes. Familiar images flashed through his mind. Early mornings on the runway. Engine checks in the cold wind. Confident nods as passengers boarded the plane. He believed he was the one who maintained order. But now he was forced to confront another possibility. Perhaps he had confused order with power. His phone rang. A message from the pilots' union. "We've reviewed the file. Your case is very difficult." Harris put the phone down. No one yelled at him, calling him a bad person. No one cursed at him on television. There was only a long, drawn-out silence, and a future that was no longer clearly defined. At Harbor Executive, the board met behind closed doors. One person suggested they quickly end this story. Another said they needed to protect their reputation. Michael Turner listened to everything. Then, he said something that silenced the room. "Reputation is not something we protect by remaining silent." No one objected. They knew that from this moment on, Harbor Executives couldn't go back to their old ways. Not because they were afraid of the media, but because they had seen themselves in the mirror. On the same day, another letter was sent. This time it was from the legal department. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, has confirmed it has launched an independent review of security procedures and crew decision-making authority at several private airports, including Harbor Executive. There are no immediate penalties. No hasty conclusions. One thing is very clear: this issue is no longer confined within the 4 walls of a company. Alyssa Monroe received the news while sitting in her New York office at Monroe Analytics. She had just finished a long product strategy meeting. When Daniel Brooks walked in, she had a hunch. "They fired him," Daniel said. Alyssa nodded. She didn't ask for any further details. "The FAA has also gotten involved," Daniel continued. Alyssa leaned back in her chair. "I know," she said. Daniel looked at her, hesitating. "Do you find it burdensome?" he asked. Alyssa thought for a few seconds. "Yes," she replied, "but not because of the outcome." Daniel waited. "I feel burdened because," Alyssa said slowly, "I know there are so many people who only start to change when they have no other choice." Daniel nodded. "Are you worried we've gone too far?" he asked. Alyssa looked at him. "If going too far means there's no turning back," she said, "then I think I've gone far enough." She stood up and walked to the window. The city below was still bustling. Commuters, taxis, lived on, unaware that somewhere a system was being forced to rewrite itself. Alyssa's phone rang. An email from Michael Turner. "We have begun reviewing the entire pilot evaluation and decision-making process. This will be a lengthy process." Alyssa answered briefly. "Thank you for not stopping at the easiest decision." She added nothing more. In a small cafe near the airport, a young ground staff member sat reading the news on his phone. He had stood there that night witnessing Alyssa Monroe being stopped. He had bowed his head, saying nothing. Now he's reading the news about Captain Harris's dismissal, about the audit, about the FAA. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt relieved. It was as if something that had once weighed heavily on his chest had now been given its proper name. In his apartment, Harris opened an old drawer. Inside was his first flight badge, its edges frayed. He held it up for a long time. He thought about all the times he had said, "I know how to judge people." He had never asked himself, what if I'm wrong? Now he no longer has a cockpit to return to. Only one question remains for him to carry with him. Can he become a different person now that his old role is gone? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, and no one owes him an answer. Alyssa Monroe finished her workday later than usual. Before leaving the office, she paused for a moment, gazing at the empty conference room. She thought about all the difficult decisions a leader has to make, decisions that don't get applause, decisions where there are no winners. She knew the price of changing the system wasn't just lost positions. It was sleepless nights, strained relationships, whispers behind her back. But she also knew something else equally obvious. Not making any changes is actually much more expensive. When Alyssa turned off the lights and left the office, she didn't feel like she had just defeated anyone. She just felt like she had done something that no one else had been willing to do for too long. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the Harbor Executive, other people were beginning to understand that the law of cause and effect doesn't need to be screamed. It just needs to be allowed to happen. After all, the meetings, emails, and irreversible decisions, Alyssa Monroe allowed herself to do something very simple. She stopped. It wasn't about stopping work. It wasn't about stepping back from responsibility. It was about pausing to listen to her own body, something she had neglected for years. That morning, Alyssa didn't go to the office early. She stayed in her apartment, made coffee, and opened the window, letting the cool, early autumn breeze of New York flow in. The city below was still moving, but in the small room, everything seemed to slow down. She sat down on the sofa legs, curled up, hands clutching a warm cup of coffee. For the first time in days, she didn't open her laptop right away. In that silence, the feeling of exhaustion was very noticeable. I'm not tired from the pressure of public opinion. I'm tired from standing straight for too long. Alyssa realized something she had never put into words. Leading in moments like these requires not only courage, but also emotional resilience. And that resilience isn't always limitless. She thought about those sleepless nights when her mind was still racing with what-if scenarios. What if she had remained silent? What if she had reacted differently? What if she had simply boarded the plane and flown away? Every question can lead to an easier path, but it's also more empty. Her phone vibrated. A message from her mother. "Are you eating properly?" Alyssa smiled. Questions like that always come at the right time. She replied, "I'm fine. I'm taking the day off." Her mother immediately replied, "Taking time off is important work." Alyssa put the phone down. She knew her mother wasn't saying that to comfort her. She was saying it because she'd lived long enough to understand that humans weren't created to just suffer. At lunchtime, Alyssa took a walk around the neighborhood. No headphones, no calls. She observed the little things: a man walking his dog across the street, an elderly couple sitting on a bench, a young girl on the phone laughing as she walked. Those images reminded her that the world isn't just about open battles. Much of life unfolds in quiet moments that go unnoticed. She wondered, how many moments of quiet reflection have I inadvertently missed? In the afternoon, Daniel Brooks stopped by the apartment. No laptop, no documents. Just a bag of hot bread. "I'm not here today as a colleague," he said, setting his bag down on the table. "I'm here as someone who's worked with you long enough to know when you need to be quiet." Alyssa chuckled softly. "So, I'm actually that predictable?" Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. "You look like someone who's been carrying too much and hasn't had time to put it down." They sat and ate in silence for a few minutes. No rush. No need to fill the silence with words. "Do you regret it?" Daniel asked very softly. Alyssa thought for a moment. "No," she replied, "but I am sad." "What are you sad about?" he asked. "It's sad because," Alyssa said slowly, "for change to occur, someone has to suffer. And even though I know that's necessary, I'm still not used to being the direct cause." Daniel nodded. Leadership isn't about feeling nothing, he said. Leadership is about doing the right thing even when you feel a lot. Alyssa looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. That evening, Alyssa opened her email for the first time that day. Not to reply, just to read. Some letters were short without full signatures. Some contained only a few sentences. I used to think I was just imagining things. Thank you for calling it by its proper name. Your story gave me the courage to speak up at work. Alyssa doesn't reply to every email. She reads them, then lets them go. She realized a very simple truth: healing is not about erasing what has happened, but about allowing it to have meaning. Night fell. The city lights came on. Alyssa stood before the mirror tying her hair back. Her face reflected weariness, but also something else: intactness. She didn't let anger control her. She didn't become the kind of person the system was used to dealing with. She kept her own voice. Before going to bed, Alyssa jotted down a few lines in the small notebook she had carried with her for years. Today, I'm not changing the world. I'm just not letting it repeat itself the way it used to be. She closed the notebook. Elsewhere in the city, Captain Robert Harris was also experiencing a very quiet evening. No engine noise, no flight schedules, no radios. He sat at his desk, staring at his hands. For the first time in decades, he had nowhere to go the next morning. In that silence, he reflected on the words that had come back to haunt him. He offered no excuses, no justifications. He asked a question he had never asked before. If I have hurt someone even unintentionally, how will I live on? That question doesn't have an immediate answer. But it exists. And, for Harris, its existence was a start. Alyssa Monroe fell asleep later than usual. Her sleep wasn't deep, but it was peaceful. In her dream, she found herself standing on a runway. It wasn't raining. No one was stopping her. Just soft light and a wide-open space before her. When she woke up, it was already daylight. And with that light, Alyssa knew that healing didn't end the story. It prepared the way for the next step. The flight went smoothly. There were no technical glitches, no security incidents. Nothing memorable happened in the usual way. And that's what made Alyssa Monroe realize the most memorable things are when everything goes exactly as it's supposed to. She sat by the window, watching the clouds drift below. The flight crew worked neatly and professionally, without excessive formality or ingratiating airs. All interactions were so normal that it was pleasant. When the plane landed, Alyssa walked down the steps. There were no scrutinizing glances, no moment of hesitation, just another arrival. But Alyssa knew that it didn't happen naturally. At the small station, a ground staff member approached. "Hello, Mrs. Monroe," the girl said clearly. "We've completed all the verification. Your car is waiting up ahead." Alyssa nodded. "Thank you," she replied. The girl smiled. Her smile held no fear. It was simply the confidence of someone doing the right thing. Alyssa walked away, a strange feeling in her heart. Not victory, but the feeling of having returned to normalcy. In the days that followed, Alyssa returned to her familiar routine. Meetings, decisions, flying, work. But small details began to emerge, catching her attention. During a business meeting, a middle-aged man shook her hand and looked her straight in the eye. "I've been following her story," he said. "Not in the newspapers, but through how my company has been working with the harbor executive recently." Alyssa didn't answer immediately. "They're different," he continued. "Not perfect, but different." Alyssa smiled. "Being different is a new beginning," she said. At Monroe Analytics, Alyssa noticed subtle changes within her own team. There were more questions in meetings, more caution in the face of seemingly obvious assumptions. A young engineer said during the project review, "I think we need to double-check the input data. It's possible it reflects an unconscious bias." No one laughed. No one dismissed it. Daniel Brooks looked at Alyssa from the far end of the table, his eyes conveying a silent understanding. Things like that don't make headlines. But Alyssa knew they were the most sustainable parts of change. One afternoon, Alyssa returned to Harbor Executive Airfield, not to fly, but for a brief work meeting. Michael Turner met her at the door. "Did you notice?" he asked as they walked down the hallway. "What?" Alyssa asked. "The way people see her," Turner said, "is not as a symbol. It's as part of a system." Alyssa thought for a moment. "Perhaps," she said, "because I never wanted to be an icon." Turner nodded. In the meeting room, a group of young employees presented the results of an internal review. They talked about weaknesses, negative feedback. They didn't shy away from it. A young girl said, her voice trembling slightly. Previously, I thought that if I asked questions, I would be seen as causing trouble. The room was silent. What now? Turner asked. Now, she replied, I think silence is the real problem. Alyssa listened without interrupting. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence there was enough. After the meeting, Alyssa stood alone in the area overlooking the runway. She recalled the moment she stood in the rain, the lights shining directly into her face, feeling uncertain about whether she was allowed to proceed. The place is still the same now, but the feeling is different. She understood that the world doesn't change just because one person stands up. It changes because many people choose not to turn away anymore. Alyssa's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. I was the ground staff member on duty that day. I didn't say anything. Now I want to say thank you. Alyssa stared at the words for a long time. She answered briefly. Thank you for speaking up now. That evening, Alyssa attended a small talk without press or live stream. The audience consisted of only a few dozen people, leaders, middle managers, and those grappling with the question, how can we bring about change without destroying people? Someone asked Alyssa, do you think things would be different if you weren't the CEO? Alyssa didn't shy away from the vastness question. Yes, she replied, and that's why I think I have a responsibility to do more. Another person asked, are you afraid of being labeled? Alyssa smiled softly. I fear silence more, she said, because silence always sides with the old ways. When the talk ended, no one applauded loudly, but many lingered. They weren't looking for motivation. They were looking for permission to do things differently. On the way home, Alyssa looked out the car window. The city was lit up. People passed each other, each with their own story. She thought of Captain Robert Harris, not with judgment, but with an open question: would the new systems help people like him change before they lost everything? She didn't have the answer. But she knew that question now lingered in more rooms than before. Alyssa Monroe arrived home, took off her shoes, and put down her bag. She stood in front of the mirror looking at herself. No aura, no icon. She was simply a woman who refused to walk past something wrong as if it were normal. She thought about the future, not a grand future, but about ordinary days when no one had to stand in the rain to be recognized. And Alyssa knew when the world's perspective changes, it's not because it learns something new, but because it finally decides to look more closely. Several months after the incident at Harbor Executive Airfield, things had calmed down. No more new articles. No more heated debates on social media. No one is mentioning Alyssa Monroe as the center of an incident anymore. And that's exactly what Alyssa wanted. One early winter morning, she stood in the small kitchen of the Monroe Analytics office brewing tea. Soft sunlight streamed through the window, casting quiet patches of light on the floor. Employees entered one by one, greeting her, as usual. No more formality. No more reserve. Normal. Alyssa realized that being normal was the hardest achievement. Daniel Brooks walked in carrying a stack of documents. The quarterly report, he said. By the way, the Harbor executive just sent the final update. Alyssa took it and flipped through a few pages. Nothing shocking. Just improving numbers, more clearly documented processes, and less ambiguous feedback. There's a small detail, Daniel added. They added a new item to the internal report. Alyssa looked up. What is it? She asked. Daniel smiled. Those situations didn't happen. Alyssa chuckled softly. It sounds very unfamiliar, she said. But it's very real, Daniel replied. Alyssa nodded. She knew exactly what that meant. Situations that hadn't happened, times when no one was stopped. No one had to explain themselves. No one had to stand under the spotlight feeling like they were in the wrong place. There are no numbers to measure these things, but they exist. That afternoon, Alyssa had a brief meeting with a group of young female leaders. No cameras, no large forum, just a small meeting room with eyes that were both curious and reserved. One person in the group asked, "Do you think you've changed a lot?" Alyssa thought for a long time before answering. "I don't think that way," she said. "I think I'm just making it harder to avoid looking straight ahead." Another person asked, "What made you decide not to remain silent that day?" Alyssa didn't answer immediately. She remembered the rain, the lights, that brief moment when she could step onto the plane and leave everything behind. "Because I've been silent enough times already," she said, and each time I have to carry that feeling home with me." The room was silent. Alyssa looked at each face in front of her. "If there's one thing I want everyone to remember," she said, "it's this: you don't need to be a hero, just don't be someone who turns away." The meeting ended not with applause, but with slow nods. Alyssa knew those nods would stay with him for a long time. A few weeks later, Alyssa flew back to Harbor Executive Airfield. No prior notice, no special schedule. The weather was clear that day. When the car stopped, a security officer approached and greeted her. "Hello, Mrs. Monroe," he said. "We verified this. You can go this way." No scrutinizing glances. No moment of hesitation. Alyssa walked. Each step was light. She paused for a moment, looking around. The runway was the same. The control room was the same. But something was distinctly different: the air. She encountered a few familiar faces. Some nodded in greeting. Some smiled. No one avoided her gaze. Nor did anyone show excessive respect. A young ground staff member, the one who had sent a thank you message, walked by. He stopped, hesitated, then said, "Hello, Mrs. Monroe. My shift today was pretty normal." Alyssa smiled. "That's good," she replied. He nodded and walked away. Alyssa stood alone, looking at the airplane steps. She remembered the first time she stood here, feeling uncertain about whether she was allowed to proceed. That question no longer exists. It's not because she's stronger. It's because the system has been forced to be more transparent. Elsewhere, in the city, Captain Robert Harris is taking on a new job, unrelated to aviation. No fame, no power. One afternoon, he walked home and stopped in front of a small shop. In the reflection, he saw himself, older, more withdrawn. He no longer tries to justify the past, but he doesn't shy away from it either. He knows he's lost a lot, and he knows that loss is real. But for the first time, he also realized something. There are things that need to be lost in order for a person to begin learning again. He turned his back and walked away without resentment or explanation. His story needs no further telling. That evening, Alyssa Monroe returned home. She sat by the window, watching the city lights come on. She thought about everything that had happened, not as a series of victories, but as a very human journey. She thought of the rain, of the silence, of decisions that no one applauded, and she thought about the future. Not a future where everything is fair, but a future where injustice is no longer considered normal. Alyssa opened her small notebook and wrote the final line for this story. Legacy isn't about how you're remembered, but about ensuring that those who come after you don't have to go through what you went through. She closed the notebook. Out there, the world goes on. It's not perfect. It's not perfectly fair. But in some places, very specific places, someone wasn't stopped. Someone didn't have to explain themselves. Someone was treated like a human being. And that for Alyssa Monroe was enough. Alyssa Monroe's story is not a story of triumph. It is a story about the limits of silence. In life, many of us have learned to be patient in order to maintain peace. We are accustomed to asking ourselves, wouldn't it be easier to just ignore it? Would speaking up make things worse? And most of the time we choose to remain silent. But this story reminds us of an important point. Silence isn't always the best policy. Sometimes it only allows wrongdoing to persist. Alyssa didn't stand up because she wanted to punish someone. She stood up because she understood that if she had boarded the plane and flown away that day, tomorrow, someone else would be standing in that exact same spot. Less power, less voice, and more hurt. The lesson here isn't that everyone has to become an activist. Rather, it's that when we have the ability to speak out, our silence is also a choice, and that choice has consequences. At any age, the most valuable thing is not winning or losing, but living without betraying one's own sense of right and wrong. If this story makes you think of a moment in your life, a time when you were silent, or when you were braver than you thought, then it has fulfilled its mission. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the whole story. If you see yourself in it, even just a small part, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling slow, kind, and very human stories. See you in the next story.